Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're going to do some work on this engine. When we last stopped, we got our cams popped in there. They're kind of lined up, and we were talking about basically getting our timing belts and everything put back on. And that's basically the plan. So we're going to think about this for a minute, make sure we got a kind of like the order of operations down, and we got all our parts, and we're going to get started. But basically my first thought is we can't do the timing belt or any of that. We got to get these cam seals installed, because obviously once the belt's on, you can't take the gear off to then get back here and put these seals in. So I think our next step is to actually take these. I'm probably going to put like a, see how these have a hex here and here? I'm going to put a crescent wrench on these two camshafts and then clamp them together with like a C-clamp or something. And that'll prevent the cams from moving, so that I can then remove this piece of plastic and pull the cam gears, because I don't want this to move in case it like bends a valve or whatever. I don't want it, you know, I like to think it's not interference, but I've bent valves before, so we're just going to treat it like an interference motor. So we're going to lock out the cams and basically pull this plastic, pull the cam gears, these caps. I'm going to pull both of them, clean everything one last time, and we're going to get some RTV, and I'm just going to glue these caps down as we bolt them down. We'll torque the caps, we'll torque all these caps, and then we'll put our our camshaft seals in each of their respective bores. Once that looks good, you'll note I wrote bad all over this. This is a defective VVT actuator, so this is not the one going on my car. I'm going to go find mine, inspect it. I might even take it apart. We'll see, because I'm kind of curious what's bad on this one and how mine compares to a bad one. But maybe that'll be a little derailment. But once we're happy with that, we're going to put these gears back on, think about this and probably do nothing. And then our crankshaft, when we took this apart, for those of you that saw the video, we had hell getting this dampener off. And as you look at the crank, you can see it's got marks on it. Unfortunately, it galled up when I pressed this thing on years ago. And actually I remember that happening and not understanding what was going on, but, well, what was happening, but I mean, it did go on there, so I just pressed it on. So it kind of fucked my crank up. That makes me a little sad, but I think I mentioned it before, this motor's not long for this world, so I don't think that's really going to matter. But we're going to go around it one last time and just knock the rust off and sorry about that. We're going to go around and knock the rust off and kind of polish this just a tiny bit. I don't want to change the diameter very much, but I want to knock all the high spots off, because the last thing I need is for this to gall going together again, because that cost me a few weeks and a few $100s to get the dampener rebuilt. Plus, look what it did to my crank. So we're going to get that prepped, clean all this, because you can tell, maybe you can tell, it's dirty. There's, if I zoom in, you can see little specks of dirt and dust. Get all this stuff cleaned pretty well. Decide if we're going to change this, because it's really pretty fresh. I changed that not too long ago, so probably going to leave that seal. Get all this cleaned and test fit our parts, make sure it looks like we have all the right stuff, and then get this thing going back together. Dampener, timing belt. I don't think I'm going to put the covers on. I think we're going to run this with no covers on the timing belt. But anyway, get this all hooked back up and timed correctly, and maybe even get the valve cover on. I got to think about that. We might have a project for the valve cover. We'll see. But if nothing else, get all this buttoned up where I can cover it up and keep this clean and have my motor ready to go. So anyway, here we go. Alright, so here's that cam lockout we talked about. Real straightforward, just a couple crescent wrenches and a clamp to hold them together, and now none of this will be able to rotate. So that'll keep everything good as we take this apart to do our cam seals. Alright, so we're getting ready to put our motor together. One of the things we got to do is test fit, and we're putting our new trigger wheel on. This is our Flying Miata 36 tooth wheel. That's the stock one that was actually installed on here. Let's get those out of the way. This is the one that I used to run on my car, and I noticed something that I think is worth pointing out. We see that tooth. Let me rotate it, show you the next tooth. It's bent, big time. That one's like, not so great. That one's bent a little bit too. But that one's really bent. So, whoops. Not sure if it was like that when I was on the car, but I bet it was. So, or I don't know. But that's bad. So luckily the new one will be fixing that problem. So this dampener, just to do a quick little thing, is in pretty amazing condition, because I just had it rebuilt. Which is actually probably a blessing, even though it cost a lot of money. It's still cheaper than a new one. So it turns out you're supposed to rebuild these once in a while. If you look here, it says street and drag race up to 800 horse every 5 years. But they kind of have conflicting stuff. Like here it says 5 years, but then in some other paperwork it shows like every year. So who knows? But it's all fresh now, so we should be good for at least a couple years probably. So they changed out a few parts, gave it a rebuild. And one thing I noticed was when they assembled it, so I gave them my stock little wheel, and they installed it for me, but they clocked it wrong. So not sure if they know the right way to do that on a Miata, but it looks like they just dropped it on there and sent it. So that was installed improperly. No big deal. I'm going to check. This is just part of how you do engines and how you build a car. You just don't make assumptions. You check things. So, for example, I had to take these screws out. Well, even if I didn't have to take the screws out, I would have took these out probably just to make sure they were installed correctly. And they were. If you zoom into this hole, that is red Loctite. Kind of looks like rust. But it should be red Loctite because it's on the bolts too. And they were stuck, you know, as you'd expect with Loctite. So they done a good job on that. We're going to clean it correctly and put more Loctite and then put this back together and torque it up with a torque wrench so that we know that's right. And we'll get our new wheel on here and this should be ready to go. Alright, so I wanted to cover a little detail. There's a phrase, details matter. This is a detail that definitely matters when you're building a street car or something that you want to be reliable, and especially race cars, which is how to use Loctite. And we're just going to do like I could spend an hour going over this, but let's keep it down to like 2 minutes. So Loctite is basically a glue that, you know, makes the fastener stick to the threads, more or less. So when I took this apart, ATI had Loctited these bolts into the part. I want to show you something. This is after I removed the bolts that were Loctited. I wiped the threads on this piece of cloth, and what you'll note is there's a bunch of dirt and grease on those bolts. It's probably grease. The thing is, when you buy brand new fasteners, they come coated in oil, and that oil is keeps them from rusting. But if you ever go read the instructions for anything like paint or Loctite or whatever, it'll always tell you to clean all the oil off before you try to apply something that sticks. It's kind of common sense. But I don't think they really did that, because they were pretty dirty. So that's basically cleaning the dirt off the threads. This is cleaning the Loctite out of the female threads that were on the part. I can't see that now, but I went ahead and cleaned that too. And I don't have the tap, so what I did was I went back and forth between brake parts cleaner and using an air gun, and also running the bolts in. So I would like spray it out, blow it out, spray some wet brake clean, and just thread the bolt into the hole and kind of use it as a tap to kind of chase the threads, and just did that a few times until I thought I had them clean. So that's also important. There's a couple of reasons. One, I'm not a chemist, but there's some type of like ionic reaction that happens. So Loctite needs to actually touch metal. So this black oxide on the bolt will actually prevent it from, maybe it's not oxide. Maybe it is, I can't remember. But I think the oxide layer stops it. I know Inconels don't work. So basically it needs to be contacting steel for some ionic reaction to happen. So getting it clean is kind of important. So we cleaned the threads, we cleaned the bolts, got all that ready. And what I do is I put all the 4 bolts in. So you can see I got 2 of these marked. What I did was I put all 4 bolts in, snugged them down, then I would back 1 bolt out, apply Loctite, immediately run that bolt in, torque it down, and the last thing I do is I take a paint pen and I come over here and I put a single mark between the bolt and the area next to it. And that way if the bolt ever spins, you can tell that it's backed out, so like whenever I disassemble this next time, I'll be able to see if any of these bolts backed out. But it also just lets me know these have been torqued. This is like my QC, so like right now, I just stopped to film a video and I've only done half the bolts. How do I know which ones I've done? Well, they're marked. Kind of simple, but it's a good way to do things, and then you know it's been done. Because I could say torque these bolts and then come back in a month and be like, hey, I don't remember, did I even Loctite this? And I can look and be like, oh yeah, I've got the marks on it. I know that these are done. So it's a good little thing for QC. Anyway, we're going to keep putting this together. But I thought I'd show you guys a little tip for how to properly use Loctite. Alright, these are all put in. Not going to lie, I did not use a torque wrench. I couldn't find the torque spec. And just from experience, when you're dealing with tiny little fasteners, sometimes doing things by feel is actually better. So if you've never done something like this, you should probably use a torque wrench and use torque specs. But you can basically feel, and I had a good idea of how to do that. Another little tip, so I used red Loctite. which is high strength. Blue is generally medium strength, red is high strength. Because this sees so much vibration being on a crankshaft, I use red, and even ATI uses red. So the thing with red is it's a high strength and it's typically high temp, which means in a couple years or whatever, if you try to take this apart, a Loctite's still going to be holding. So the way you get rid of Loctite is you use heat or fire. So what I would do is I would take a torch and just basically put it right on the head of this bolt for probably, I don't have like oxyacetylene, I just have like a little MAP gas or propane, probably about 20 to 25 seconds, maybe less because this has rubber in it and I don't want to overheat any of that. But basically you just very quickly get this hot, and once you get up to about 450 to 550 F, somewhere in that temperature range, it'll kill the Loctite. And that will make removing these bolts, it's as if they didn't have Loctite anymore, which is great for getting them out. So little pro tip for you guys, if you ever have to deal, if you know you have a bolt that has Loctite, and especially if you're worried about stripping it because of the Loctite, you can kill the Loctite with heat before you remove it. Alright, so we just got our cam caps final installed, and the cams are final installed. So what I do is these two caps, I pulled the front ones, and I basically clean the metal on the cap and on the head, and then I get it super clean, like 2 or 3 times with brake cleaner or acetone or something. And I put a really, really light coat of gray RTV, and then stick them down and torque them up, and then wipe off these inside bores. And I like to do that because I think it helps guarantee you don't have an oil leak. It's probably, I think it's required, but I don't really check the book on that. I know if I do that, it won't leak. So we just got those done. We torqued it all up. And I will show you guys something that if you're working on things, if you're willing to spend some money, I paid, or I think this torque wrench was like $100, $125, something like that. And it's kind of unique. It's a digital torque wrench. So basically, it's set at 120 inch-pounds. And this torque wrench, when you go to torque it, it lights up, it beeps, and it vibrates as you approach final torque. And when you hit final torque, it goes, you know, full vibrate, full beep. So it really gives you good feedback. So I was able to torque, you know, 10 bolts in about 1.5 minutes using that wrench. And that's even going back and checking them all to make sure that, you know, everything's good. So real nice. And these things are, you know, it's basically, it's a good one. It's not a cheap one. So it's gear wrench. And they come calibrated with paperwork, so I take care of it, and it's nice to have a good torque wrench. And this kind of speeds things up too, which I like. So anyway, if you ever working on stuff, sometimes it pays to have good tools. Like that's not a $500 torque wrench. You can spend $1,000 on a torque wrench. But I think this thing was like $100, $125, and it's kind of worth it. So anyway, got the cams, our final install. We just checked, I did have the cam seals. There they are. So I think those are next, and I glue those in as well, which is, it's not required. In fact, the factory is you just press them in dry, or even oil them. I think you oil them as the spec. I never do that. I glue these things in. And one of the reasons is, I've had engines that have high back pressure, whether it's due to wear or due to engine failure. But for example, I've cracked pistons a few times, and when you crack a piston, your crankcase pressure, you can just imagine how high the crankcase pressure gets when you have a hole in your piston. But because I glue all the seals in, they stay put. And some of these seals, if it pops a seal, it can start blowing oil everywhere, and that could cause, you know, smoke or a fire, or at least a mess at a minimum. So by gluing them in, I don't have to worry about that. It's kind of, that's the point, you just don't worry about it. So, and also it's another way for them to not leak. So obviously you don't glue it to this because this is where it moves. I just basically, I reach in here with like Q-tips or a rag and acetone or brake clean and clean those bores real nice. And then when it's time to go together, I just reach in here and put a real light coat of RTV, and then same thing on the seal, and then press the seals in, and there you go. Once that RTV dries, they're kind of hard to remove, but they don't leak and they don't fall out, and that's valuable. So anyway, about to pop those seals in. We did, I guess I'll show you this. So I know this looks horrible on camera, all these gouge marks, but if you ignore that, the rest of it looks real shiny. We actually did a polish, got the crank, you know, cleaned up. So I think we're good now. It sucks that that's gouged, but that's all under the surface, not poking up, I believe. So basically we're going to put like copper coat. I believe we're going to use copper coat. So it's like copper anti-seize. We're going to put that on this, put it on the dampener, and then install the dampener and just kind of cross our fingers that that goes well. That's what ATI recommended, and I know for sure when I put this together I did not put copper coat on that. So hopefully, well, not hopefully, it's probably a little looser now than it should be, which is probably not good. But on the plus side, that should reduce the chance of galling. I'm going to do copper on both. Hopefully it goes together decent, because it's supposed to be a press fit by a little bit. So hopefully it's still a little bit of a press fit. Get that sucker on there and start getting this timing belt put together.